Hi there, my name is Jake Shulak. I'm a student here at Columbia College. Today I want to help explain to people how to get your start in scuba diving. So if you want to begin this journey of scuba diving, where exactly do we begin? We all know that we're going to need some sort of training. We're going to need to understand the equipment that we're going to need. We also have to be able to figure out cool places that we want to be able to go visit. Do the places that you visit, does that depend on the equipment that you have, or do you have to pick new equipment for those places? How do you know if places are safe or not? So let's talk about those things, and I'll use some examples to be able to try and help you understand some of the things we're going to need to get going. So first, what type of training do we need? So PADI is the name of a company that stands for the Professional Association of Diving Instructors. They talk about the first level of training being called autonomous diving certification. And in that first level, you learn all about how to be aware of your body, of your equipment, and of your surroundings. So when they talk about breathing, that's one part of the body. So they teach you how exactly to breathe. You're supposed to breathe just as you do when you're above water, but it feels a little bit weird to do that for the first times. The second thing that they talk about is what we find from a Rubicon Foundation article, and they talk about the equipment. So that's going to talk about your depth gauges, that's going to talk about the PSI in your tank, and also the connections on your tank. So you have to make sure that all the connections are correct before you go out there, and that nothing is corroded, all that kind of stuff. The depth gauge is probably the most important part underwater, though, knowing how deep you are so you can find out how deep did you dive and how quickly, and also how long is it going to take you to be able to surface. The PSI gauge goes hand in hand with that. So the PSI is going to tell us how much oxygen we have left in our tanks, and that's going to be very helpful for two main reasons. One, you have to be able to breathe underwater, and two, it helps inflate your suit, sort of like a submarine, so it provides you the buoyancy to be able to actually float back up to the surface quicker. There's a manual for aquatic diving that teaches us that the second level of PADI certification is how to dive with somebody else. And they say in that article that the number one most important thing is visibility. You have to be able to see that other person, you have to be able to see all of the surroundings. And if you can't, you could be in a very unsafe situation, especially if you're relying on hand signals for underwater communication. The next thing to think about with the second person is experience. Are you more experienced than the other person? Then you should probably be the one that takes control and says how the dive is going to go. The other person's more experienced, you should probably defer to the way that they want to be able to do things, since they're the ones that are going to be in charge of you. The next thing is, are there any limitations on the equipment? Are you wearing a wetsuit and you can't really dive in super cold water? Those are just all things you want to consider before actually taking the dive. Now that we know about the basics of the training, let's talk a little bit more about the equipment. So there's two main types of suits that we know about. There's a wetsuit, there's a dry suit. There's another Rubicon article that explains the differences between these two. The main differences are that the wetsuit, that actually means that some of you is going to get wet. It's not a completely sealed system. So if you're diving in very cold water, you risk hypothermia and a lot of those things because your skin's actually touching the water. Although it is better for beginners because there's less things to worry about. It's a pretty simple suit to deal with. The other kind is called dry suit. And in the dry suit, none of your body actually makes contact with the water. And you can see even just in this picture here that the boots are actually sewn into the suit. So all of your extremities are totally covered in that type of system. The next thing to talk about is the breathing apparatus. And it's worth mentioning that SCUBA actually is an acronym that stands for Self-Contained Underwater Breathing Apparatus. So we're underwater, we can't normally breathe there, it makes sense we have to talk about breathing. So there's two main types of systems for that. One is called an open system, and that's when you breathe and you breathe out, the oxygen actually leaves the suit. The carbon dioxide leaves the suit in the system. There's another type called a closed system, which uses some sort of recycler. And so what that does is it recycles the air so that you can breathe it more times. And that can be the difference between getting 40 minutes of dive out of a tank versus about 6 hours. So pretty massive difference in a lot of cases. So now that we've learned about the training and the equipment, let's talk a little bit about locations you might want to go check out. So Where should we go to scuba dive? There's a code of practice for inshore diving book, and that talks about some of the things that you need to look for as far as picking a site. One of the most important things, again, is visibility. If you can't see the dangers. So you always need to be able to be aware of the visibility underwater. Usually you want at least 25 to 50 feet of visibility to know that everything is going to be safe. One thing that a lot of people don't think about too at the beginning is that when you're deep enough underwater, it's sometimes difficult to tell which way is up. One interesting thing that you can use is you can actually breathe out in an open system. You can watch which directions the bubbles go. That'll give you a good idea of exactly which way to go up. So the next thing to consider is how interesting are the places in general. Here in Minnesota, if you go up north, you'll find a whole bunch of abandoned mines that have been filled with water. That just might not be all that cool. So sometimes they actually throw a car or something else down there so you can, go underwater and see a wreck of some sort. And the third thing to think about with your dive location is it freshwater or is it saltwater? Freshwater is better for equipment, it doesn't corrode as much. It's also better if you get it in your suit than saltwater is. Saltwater is just exactly the opposite, so it's going to damage your equipment a little faster and everything like that. Now, there's one other thing just to reinforce this issue for the 100th time, but there's a book called Scuba by Tom Grieve, and that just really reinforces that the temperature matters. If you're going to have a wetsuit, you have to be in warm places. If you're going to be in really cold places, you have to make sure that you have a dry suit. Otherwise, you're just going to be asking for a case of hypothermia or worse. So now that we know all of these things, let's try and wrap it up and figure out exactly our first steps here. So Patty recommends getting certified before taking any sort of dive whatsoever. They have classes that go all the way from beginner to expert dive master. We should always be aware of all the dangers that could be around us, and that will help us enjoy everything that diving can offer us. There'll always be risks, but if we realize what those are, we should be able to mitigate them. So one thing to consider with the training is that basic training, you have to be able to touch a little bit of all of the different important things of diving. With the advanced classes, those are going to be more about specific things. As with most things, the basics are most important and they require the most proficiency. So if you take only one thing away, have fun, but be aware of all the dangers. Thank you.